Trump looks at this environment and like I think he understands this vulnerability among Democrats. For historical or social reasons, they happen to run all the places with like the worst crime. Like even when like Gavin Newsom was like, oh, it's the red states. The Republican doesn't run Birmingham. Republican doesn't run St. Louis. And just for various social and historical reasons, they happen to run those places. I don't think it's because Democrats run it, right?
Well, it looks like the, quote, crackdown, the homeland crackdown, as reporter Ken Klippenstein puts it, in Chicago has, quote, already begun. So Ken published an exclusive leak over at kenklippenstein.com just recently showing that, quote, the Department of Homeland Security has requested military assistance for upcoming ICE operations in Chicago. According to a, quote, for official use only memo that I've obtained, a military advance team has already arrived. So there you have it. A military advance team has already arrived. This will probably look similar to what Trump did in Los Angeles during the crackdown on protests out there earlier this year, which obviously had a setback in court not too long ago. Trump was found to have violated posse comitatus, essentially. And now the justification, and this is going to keep being pushed through the legal system, is still likely going to look like this is going to be in the service of protecting federal officers and federal buildings. And so that's the justification for federal troops in Chicago and a federal law enforcement surge in Chicago. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, both Democrats, have pushed back strongly on this, as we covered on the show earlier this week. But here in Washington, D.C., in the meanwhile, the Washington Post reported just Thursday that the federal takeover is going to extend through the end of the year. That is the plan as of right now. So D.C. has home rule. It's a federal city. It is the nation's capital. There are different legal questions about what can and can't be done here versus Chicago, Baltimore, New York City, or Los Angeles. But Trump seems to believe he is on the winning side of this issue, which means he's going to push the boundaries of the legal system and see what goes through the courts, what happens in the courts, because Republicans are convinced this is a political winner. Many Republicans do believe that, for example, as Pritzker was doing the rounds over the weekend and 58 people were shot in Chicago, 8 of whom were shot fatally, that constitutes an emergency, even if it's something people are numb to, even if the numbers show that crime isn't as bad as it's been before. It is very bad. So Republicans believe that means a federal takeover is justified and important. Zaid Jilani wrote a great post over on theamericansaga.com. That is his newsletter. Make sure to follow it. That was titled Two Truths About Crime in America. And I think Zed threads the needle in a very helpful and nuanced way, particularly as it relates to the Democratic Party's vulnerability here, as they've shown throughout their handling of Trump's federal takeover intentions. We're also going to talk a little bit about what Republicans are getting wrong here. So if you want to see the full version of this interview, it's going to be up over at undercurrents.tv. We post the unedited versions over there for our premium subscribers in the Undercurrents community. So head on over there to see the full unedited conversation with Zed. Subscribe on YouTube. It helps us so much. If you can't pay, that's all right. YouTube subscriptions, podcast subscriptions, those help us so much as well. Without further ado, let's bring in Zaid Jilani, author of The American Saga. Now, Zed, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Your post is actually headlined Two Truths About Crime in America. And you talk a bit about your experience here in D.C. when you lived here before you left to the much more idyllic pastures of Georgia and the Atlanta area.
Sure.
But can you tell us a little bit about these two truths? Like, what are the two truths and what's your experience been?
Yeah, look, I think when people talk about crime in the country right now, they're often talking past each other because they're both saying things that are true. But they're not necessarily hearing from the other side, right? So I don't think that they're getting to the whole truth, right? Because I think, look, a lot of what Trump has done in the past few weeks is basically say our cities are hellholes, they're unlivable places, crime's out of control. So look, I'm going to dispatch FBI, DEA, National Guard, any federal resources under my control into these zones and into these places to try to get crime under control and take as much off the load of the local police as I can. And I think the Democrats are responding to this, largely in saying, look, crime is down. Past couple of years, it's been going down, actually. And, you have people like Gavin Newsom, who I think is kind of a blue state, mascot at this point, saying, hey, look, it's worse in red states. Why don't you go to Birmingham? Why don't you go to St. Louis, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And, the funny thing is, like, they're both kind of saying things that are true, right? It's absolutely true that over the past 2 years, many, especially like large metropolises, have seen drops in crime, particularly violent crime like shootings and murders. I think police have gotten a better handle over things. And I think it's true also that like Trump has not appropriately credited the people who are doing that. If I was a cop in like Chicago, right, and then I had the job of working with my colleagues and getting these shootings down the past couple of years, I'd feel a little demoralized. When the president of the United States says, "Hey, look, your place sucks. You aren't doing anything. Crime's out of control." You'd be like, "Look, I've been busting my ass the past 2, 3 years trying to do something about this." Right. On the other hand, I think that if you look at the level of violence and crime in these places on an absolute level, meaning like you compare them to other parts of the world, like America's still in a pretty bad place, right? Like I looked at, for instance, Chicago, right? That's a place where Trump is rumored to be moving federal resources to next. Chicago, roughly had like I think like 800 or a little bit more than 800 murders, like in 21, right? I looked around the world and I saw like, well, what is a city that has a similar number of people as Chicago? And Seoul in South Korea does. And it's funny, like the entire country of South Korea did not have 800 murders, right? The same year that Chicago had over 800 murders. And it actually gets worse if you realize that the violence in Chicago is not like all over the city. It's usually concentrated in a few neighborhoods, southwest side. And that means that these neighborhoods are like extremely violent, right? To a level to where like they're more violent than many developing countries are, right? Like if you are in like large cities in Ghana, right, you are not going to face as much violence as you might living in these neighborhoods of Chicago, right? That's true even now as crime has dropped over the past few years in a lot of these places, right? And so people are not completely irrational to look at that situation and look at these cities and say, look, why do we have to live like this, right? Like the rest of the world does not live like this. Like in some cases, I think it's been studied, like some neighborhoods in like Chicago or St. Louis may have death rates higher than some places that are actually at war, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's how bad it can be at times, right? And so I think that, these two truths have to be held in your mind at the same time that we have made progress on this, but that even with our progress, situation is pretty bad, right? And like it shouldn't be downplayed, particularly if you are someone who has to grow up in these communities and these places. And I think those people are often left out of the conversation altogether, right? Like I don't think not many people go to them and ask them what they want to be done or how they feel about life living in those places, right? So,
Yeah, that's a really important point because you'll remember very well during the defund the police wave of 2019 and 2020, the gap on polling between like Black Americans and white Democrats was pretty significant in terms of who actually wanted to defund the police. And said that your point about the comparisons between different places, maybe they're actually at war, and American cities also tells me it's not just a problem of material wealth or lack thereof. It's not just a problem of poverty, though poverty is certainly an issue in places like Chicago, very much an issue in Chicago. Um, so how do you see the question of policing? Because you have this very interesting anecdote in the story about how you saw a brutal act of violence in the DC metro and you went back, talked to some of your colleagues about it. You were saying like you wanted to call the police because you saw a kid being assaulted, and this is your quote, they upbraided me on the suggestion, telling me that calling the police could have been a death sentence for the teen. Excuse me, you're right. I was watching a teen being beat up so badly he was coughing up blood, and their concern was that police would emerge and gun everybody down for whatever reason. So, what do we make of that?
yeah, look, I think that really starting around, I would say 2014 with what happened in Ferguson and St. Louis area, Michael Brown, so on and so forth. I think a lot of progressive looked at this situation and they came to the conclusion that like the main problem is policing, right? That police brutality and abuse is like endemic, and that really we need to just get police out of situations, right? Because they're the ones making things worse, escalating, so on and so forth. And in some cases that may be true, right? Like in some like fringe cases, like you talk about mental health episodes and things, there may be alternative interventions. But looking back at that same event, I think everyone in America heard about Freddie Gray in Baltimore, or heard about Michael Brown in St. Louis, right? They didn't hear that much about what happened after those incidents, right? After the federal government introduced investigations and they put them under they put them under judicial orders or administrative orders that basically put the spotlight on those police while at the same time them being in the news for these crises. A lot of what happened was what was called depolicing, right? Which was like police had fewer foot patrol, they had fewer proactive policing, fewer arrests for like uh usually it's like minor crimes, but that's often how they get the major crimes. And what happened in both places in St. Louis area and also in Baltimore area was that they had some of the worst murder spikes in decades, right? Like it's hundreds of young, particularly young black men were being killed as the depolicing occurred. And I think that second part really never made it into the news. I remember I went to Baltimore. I think it was around 2018 I went. I did a story on like the murder wave. And I think there just wasn't much enthusiasm for my story among my colleagues. I was working for a left-wing outlet at the time. Because the story to them was always the cops, right? Like, what are the cops doing wrong? And it's not as if cops don't do things that are wrong, particularly in Baltimore, which was a place that had endemic corruption at every level of government, including in the police. But at the same time, like people dying is people dying, right? It doesn't matter whether it's at the hand of a police or the hands of a criminal, right? And I think that's what a lot of the sentiment I got from people who lived in these places when I talked to them was like, of course we don't want anyone abusing our rights or anything, but at the same time we want to be safe, right? And that's like one of the three things that like every American wants, right? They want to be able to put food on the table, they want to be able to have a good they want to be able to have public safety, they want to have respect, right? And I feel like all those three things are challenged in these places after all these events were occurring, right? And so I think Trump looks at this environment and like I think he understands this vulnerability among Democrats, right? Like they just for historical or social reasons they happen to run all the places with like the worst crime. Like even when like Gavin Newsom was like, oh, it's the red states. Well, like, Republican doesn't run Birmingham, Republican doesn't run St.
St.
Louis,
Louis,
right?
yeah.
Like it's really more of neighborhoods within municipalities that have all the violence, right? And just for various social and historical reasons, they happen to run those places. I don't think it's because Democrats run it, right? But and I think Trump sees that vulnerability, and he when he speaks about crime in these places, I don't think many like independent voters or even Democrats are looking at that and be like, oh no, those are totally fine places, they're totally safe. Like I'd be happy to like go to like this neighborhood in Chicago and camp out overnight. Like nobody feels that way, right? Like everybody feels a little bit scared about those places. Everyone understands their reputation, and it's a real political vulnerability, right? I think the problem is though, like the way that you typically address this, the way that's been proven to be addressed, like in the '90s or early 2000s, was largely through policing, right? Like, especially like closing cases, right? Like investigating murders and bringing people to justice. Because if you don't do that, people start bringing it into their own hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like hearing, I remember hearing about a case of a guy I was talking to and like his cousin was killed or something, and he was thinking of doing something about it, right? Like he was thinking of going to go kill that person who killed him because the police weren't taking him seriously, right? Like this is someone I personally talked to, right? Like that is a massive amount of the violence in these places, like revenge killings, honor killing, almost like honor killing type killings, because you feel like you have to avenge your family or your friend or your neighborhood. And that usually is resolved through policing. And I think we have made a lot of progress in that over the past few years as municipalities work to regrow their police ranks. A lot of people were leaving policing the past decade as they innovated in their tactics and so on and so forth. I don't think that National Guard is really like a sustainable solution. Like usually they're there for like riots or natural disaster or emergencies, right? Like they're not really trained to be cops. They don't really like investigate and interrogate and like it's not really their thing. Same thing with like FBI and DEA, right? Like they're supposed to do larger investigations, they're not really supposed to like patrol and stuff like that, right? So I don't think what Trump is doing is really a sustainable solution. I think reinforcing policing is probably the best like first step that needs to be done in all these places, which is already what was happening over the past couple of years. Uh, but I do think Democrats have a real vulnerability because like Pritzker was interviewed about this, and someone was asking about the number of murders that were in Chicago like over the weekend or the past week, and he was just like, "Well, yeah, big cities have crime, and like red states have it too." And it's like, he sounded dismissive, right? Like I think the dismissive part of it is like a real vulnerability for them.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because some of our friends, people we know, who are kind of on the left, looked at the Joe Scarborough clip from MSNBC. I think it was Tuesday, where he said, "I have a radical idea for JB Pritzker." say that you're going to work with Trump. Like, we don't want the National Guard, I think I'm paraphrasing Scarborough. We don't want the National Guard, but come in and work with us to decrease crime. And people on the left sort of laughed at that. And I get it, because on the one hand, it looks like you're saying, please, like, we'll just excuse the jackbooted thugs in DC, and, this idea that National Guard is going to solve everyone's issue. And if we're to believe the numbers, it's true that crime has dipped here in DC since the federal takeover, but whether or not that's sustainable in the long term, I think is a very legitimate question, Zed. And, it's also things like ICE and ATF and DEA, as you mentioned. So it looks like, to many people on the left, the risk there is Pritzker comes across as welcoming that. But I also kind of feel like there has to be, you write about this in the piece, you actually sort of put out a paragraph of the sort of potential framing for Democrats' language to frame their position on this in a better way. I feel like there has to be. I don't think Muriel Bowser here in D.C., Democratic mayor of D.C., has actually handled this exceptionally badly. I'm curious what you make of that, Zed, and if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think Democrats should frame this.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Bowser's a good example because I think that Bowser's probably hears a lot from our constituents, particularly in East DC, about the level of crime and disorder and lack of safety that people feel, the sense of insecurity, particularly that people feel, right? I think a lot of people are like trying to raise families and things, like they're worried about their kids. And I think because of that, you I think there's a like Democrats always have this like inclination to be like, I'm going to give you some facts, right? And once you have the facts, you're going to agree with me, right? Like it's like a college educated party, like they're always ready to debate and like to say things like that. But politics is actually more emotional, right? Like elephant and the rider, right? Like the elephant's your emotional side, the person riding the elephant's the rational side. Elephant's much more powerful, right? It's like it's big and powerful. So you have to put people's emotions at ease first. And I think that like if I was in Pritzker's shoes or if I was in, one of these people's shoes, I would just say, look, we don't want soldiers on our streets. That's not the way to handle this. But we have been making progress on crime over the past few years. We want to, but it's nowhere near good enough, right? And like there's much more to be done. And I wish that, we could all work together on hiring more detectives to solve murders. I wish we could put more cops on the street. I wish we could support programs like summer youth employment programs that keep teenagers out of trouble and working, which are shown to work pretty well in cities like New York or Baltimore, Chicago, so on and so forth. So, I think there has to be they have to walk a line, right, between not just kind of accepting what Trump is doing and endorsing it whole hog because one, it's not really effective policy wise. I don't think it would be, but two, or in the long run, and then two, it would be like kind of politically just giving in, right? I don't think Democrats want to do that. They're too polarized to do that. But at the same time, like they can't be, I think they have to be very careful about treating the level of criminal violence in American like metropolises as if it's normal or understandable or even like not worth addressing further, right? And I think it's just because like everyone in America has this keen sense that there is an unacceptable amount of crime in these places. And like that sense holds even when crime is going down. Obviously, it's there when it's going up, as it was between 2020 and like 2023. I think that it's just such a layup for Trump to say that like Chicago has too much violence because everybody thinks it has too much violence. People who live there think it has too much violence. People in the suburbs of Chicago think it has too much violence. I have some family in the Chicago area, so I'm there every now and then. Like even it's something I have to watch out for when I'm there. Like it's not something that you can just put up a chart and say, look, oh, it's going down. The line is going down. Therefore, therefore, don't worry about it, right? Like, and I think that's kind of how Pritzker responded. It's kind Newsom tried to do the like switcheroo where it's like, oh, it's not the blue states, it's the red states with all the violence. And it's like, well, one, the switcheroo almost never works in politics. People usually have like a framework in their mind that's well developed over years. And so like they associate the blue cities with the violence. And two, like I think it invokes like racist responses because people will be like, oh, that's because it's the black populations in the red states. It's like there are various social and historical factors for why, there tends to be more homicide and gun violence in those areas in the South. But like, like it's not the right way to respond, right? Like the right way to respond is just to like kind of own what's happening, acknowledge that you made some progress on it, but then concede that, yeah, it's just unacceptable. And like Trump maybe has his finger on the pulse of a real problem. He may not be responding the real way, but it's a real problem. And having the wrong solution to the right question is still something that, is still something that I think benefits him politically, right? Because some people will say, at least someone's trying to do something about all those, I hate taking my kids in for the Cubs game because it's just so dirty and disorderly and chaotic, and I'm always worried about someone shooting someone. And so, like, like it's a very broad sentiment in middle America, right? And I think that can't be dismissed, right? So
well, to hear the rest of this conversation with Zaid Jilani, where he gets into what Republicans might be doing wrong in this scenario as well, head on over to undercurrents.tv, join the Undercurrents community where you get access to the full unedited versions of these interviews. As a reminder, subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you back here with more Undercurrents soon.